Hi, today I have as my honored guest. I'm really delighted to have him, somebody that I've been following on Twitter for years and communicating, and every once in a while getting into a scuffle. But it's all good. It's all good. Sasho Todorov, who, among other things, is a lawyer, but he also has very strange hobbies, which I think is cool because I have strange hobbies. I read French strategic documents for my hobby. Sasho Todorov studies casualty data for modern conflict. Is that an accurate description?
Pretty much.
Okay.
My entire hobby is there's a classic image from the Barbie movie of, "Do you guys ever think about dying?" And that is pretty much my entire hobby.
Okay. So what kind of data do you collect?
So I collect unit level casualty data, primarily focusing, if anything, actually almost universally focusing on killed in action. I'll take wounded data on occasion if it's available, but very much focused on fatalities to as granular of level as possible. And so, for example, I've got complete data sets for World War I American fatalities, which go down to the company, but most of my data sets, which are broad ranging, are either at the battalion upwards level or the regiment upwards level.
Okay. And what conflicts do you have this kind of data for?
So I currently have coverage for World War One. I have complete coverage of the French, British, and Americans. The Americans from the company up to the army level, the French from the regiment up to the army level. Pretty much everything above regiment I did myself. And for the Commonwealth, from the battalion up to the divisional level, similarly, everything from brigade and division level I created myself off the basis of orders of battle and other information. Then for World War II, I have again the Commonwealth from a battalion to division level. I'm working on the French data set. Then for Korea, which is my gold standard database, I have all American Army casualties organized from regiment up to the Army level. And then I have a smattering of others, a experimental Yugoslav data set. And what I'm working on now, which has kind of been my flagship project, is a casualty database covering unit level Russian fatalities
In which conflict?
in the war in Ukraine, in the Russian
In the war in
invasion of
Ukraine.
Ukraine.
Okay.
I do have for that. I've been working on as well a Ukrainian database for the period of 2014 to 2022. But right now, there's no really good unit level data for the Ukrainians for the current war from 2022 onwards, and there won't be for at least a year until after this war is over.
Okay. Whenever it is finally over.
Yeah.
So what I'd love to ask you and talk to you about, because basically you have this sort of this very it's this wonderful combination of like this high level 30,000 foot view of modern conflict, but it's also one that's grounded into the sort of the granular data of like company level casualty statistics. So, I mean, it almost sounds like a contradiction, but I feel like that gives you a very, very unique perspective into modern conflict. So, a thing that I wanted to ask you about, therefore, to lead with is a question of whether or not you have seen any particular trends that you think are noteworthy, like stuff that maybe you didn't even expect to see when you started this project or got into this?
Very much so, actually. So the biggest trend has been mostly about when people are dying. There's basically two, by going kind of down to these granular unit levels, the goal is to study fatalities from two perspectives. The geographic constraint, where do they die, basically in what unit are they dying, and then the temporal or chronological constraint, which is when are they dying. What you see is starting with really the birth of modern warfare, which I would argue is the Russo-Japanese War and the Battle of Mukden. You see a steady transition away from what we would traditionally consider to be battle. As in, our sense of a battle is that there is this very discrete chronological period in a discrete geographical area where a major event happens and then something ensues from it. It's one of the reasons why. So it's one of the reasons why, for example, when people talked about the Battle of Bakhmut, the length of the Battle of Bakhmut itself became, in a way, an indictment of the Russians because our idea is a battle is constrained. If a battle goes on for very long, it means that the attacking side is failing to accomplish what it seeks to do. This is, to a degree, true in World War One. When you look at, for people call it, for example, the Battle of the Somme. In reality, it's the Somme operation. And within the Somme operation, you can see this very distinct, pattern of there are spikes. There is a day of extremely severe fighting. and extremely high casualties. There's 2 to 3 days of fairly high intensity fighting after it. First Battalion got a foothold in the second trench line. Can we consolidate? Can we expand? Can we hold on? Can we get a communication trench up to there? Launch a reserve brigade as an attack to kind of help expand the breach? We can't. Okay, we got thrown back. We all get ready, we all sit back, we all accumulate a lot more shells, we get ready for another go. By World War II, this is still kind of extent, but the chronological period is starting to lengthen. So whereas you go from a division has a day of extremely severe fighting, 2 to 3 days of medium scale fighting, by which point the division is very heavily battered and it's rotated out for another division. Now by World War II, what you really see more is about 2 week periods of a division will go on the offensive for about 2 weeks. They'll take about 500 fatalities during these 2 weeks, then they'll be pulled out. So you're already starting to see a chronological lengthening of the experience of battle. What is happening now in Ukraine, and it's become a very, very common pattern, is that Russian brigades are instead engaging in, frankly, they're not rotating. They're not rotating. They don't really have spikes. They certainly have very severe days. What you're seeing is extremely heavy casualties being produced by long series of days where you lose 20 men, or 30 men, or 20 men, or 40 men, or 30 men, or 20 men. But because it's happening again and again and again and again and again and again nonstop for months on end, you're creating these 1,000 fatality months, which have been occurring for certain brigades who were losing 1,000 dead in a month, and in none of those days is the fighting what we would consider to be particularly severe by the standards of World War II or World War One.
So let's see if we can unpack this in terms of the implications. One of the first things that comes to mind is when your discussion of sort of the image that we might have had of battle. I was thinking, it's ultimately this Napoleonic image, but it's also important because that image of battle is the kind of image that I believe that Clausewitz talks about, the idea of also this decision in battle. You seek decision in battle, battles where the place where you find decision. And then, modern theorists would take this up, like Foch also is all about like the decision in battle. And I'm sure the American Civil War, like the whole mindset was like, let's try to set up a battle. We have a big battle and we have decision. Thus we get like Gettysburg, which is 3 days, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know the length of the comparable battles, but they're all more or less kind of like that. And there's a decision, something actually happens. And then, and probably between these battles, there are very few casualties. I'm guessing. I'm sure there's low-level skirmishes going on all the time during the American Civil War, but it's not like these 3 days in which you've got thousands die. So, one question I'd like to have, one thing I want to talk about then is where do we seek decision? From what you're saying, it almost sounds like all conflict is now about attrition, or kind of like the Battle of Verdun, which lasted like 6 months. So it was hardly like a discrete moment, but the whole point of Verdun, I believe Falkenhayn's strategy was just to bleed the French dry. So is that all that we have now? Like, are all battles about attrition and it's just about being able to maintain this at a certain battle rhythm as long as possible?
To a degree. I mean, I think you can still see in World War One. I think it was the Blutmill that Falkenhayn like to talk about. A lot of that was retroactive decision making. Well, a lot of that was retroactive justification. You see in World War One, like the opening day of Verdun, the Germans are trying to create a breach. They have the French in a vulnerable position in a salient that's really a bridgehead. And it's, can we reduce the salient? Can we break through it, crush it, and inflict significant amount of losses in one go? So you still have a pattern of seeking decision. It's just that decision has to come through multiple very heavy blows, which you can also see with Foch. I mean, if you look at one of the most interesting things I've ever looked at actually was when going through the very voluminous and detailed French official history of World War One, going through the art, which is really intended to be a guide to the much larger books of primary source materials that it relies upon. And in those books, you can see, for example, to me, the one map that is the root of modern warfare, which was the French General Staff's plans for the offensives which they're developing in the winter of 1917, which is the plans for a rolling set of offensives based upon the use of basically 1 to 2 heavy artillery trains that are motorized by truck. What the idea is that we are going to hit a sector, Because the whole problem in World War I is you hit a sector, you advance, you bog down because the ground behind you is so torn up, logistics can't get through. And so the rate of attrition, you go from overrunning several enemy divisions and completely wrecking them on day one to by day 3 or 4, you're back to about parity with the defenders. You've lost your advantage. And so what the French and what the Foch are trying to do is they're seeking decision through a series of rolling, very severe blows, where we're going to knock out, we're going to cause a severe damage to an enemy grouping here. We're going to start getting our artillery on those trucks. They're going to start rotating to the next sector while the second group is setting up an offensive. And we're going to create this rolling series of heavy hits that steadily destroy German divisions, that drain the German reserve pool to the point where we can get the German army to a point where, because the German army is going to reconstitute, but if you keep on hammering these divisions and severely damaging them, the German army is going to find themselves in a window where they have no more ammunition left in the tank, where they have no reserve divisions that are fresh and can be entered into the fray, at which point you can really start breaking the lines, which is what happens in October of 1918. You can still, and that's, I think, the problem. The
decision's also now at an operational level. This is no longer about winning the battle; it's about winning the operation.
Yes. Well, I think it's both. It's about, I think, at least in World War I and even World War II, you're winning the battle. You're causing significant disproportionate damage in the battle. You're chaining these battles to now into a larger operation where you've caused significant damage at a wider level. You're chaining these operations to create a window of time in the enemy where the enemy's out of gas, at which point you can really start causing severe damage and hopefully achieve a war-winning result, even if theoretically the enemy still has manpower they can feed into the fight at a theoretical later date once they process them into training and still have resources. You're trying to create windows. Obviously, this doesn't really happen in World War II because World War II ends with the complete destruction of Germany. The complete consumption of German resources. But at least that's, if you look at what Foch is trying to do, it's a way of seeking decision through battles and chained operations to create a window. The problem with the modern era is that that's just not possible because of the way in which you're not able to severely damage a unit in a brief amount of time. You're causing severe damage over a long time, but the enemy is just constantly free to top their units back up. So as you say, it becomes at a strategic level a pure question of attrition because you can't create those windows of crisis anymore.
So let's thinking about this. You go to like Austerlitz or Jena, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's 2 or 3 days for, I don't know, it's decisive in the sense that, the French completely like liquidate the Austrian army, like break it.
Mm-hmm.
And then Austria's got nothing. And so Austria loses the war. I'm oversimplifying, but.
Correct.
Okay, World War I and World War II that's already not happening. Not really. I mean, you could talk about how a certain battle might be like a turning point or a high water mark or, Stalingrad, that kind of thing. But ultimately, it's not the case where there's any defeat then leads to sort of the end. Maybe I'm already thinking of counterexamples, like maybe Sedan in May 1940 or something. But by and large, the Germans could beat the French at a certain place, but that doesn't mean that the French army's done. It just means that they have an advantage there. What matters then is the Germans' ability to follow up. And there are other factors that ultimately contribute to France's defeat, but it's more of the operational thing than having lost any particular battle. So nowadays it's even less so in a sense. And part of this has to do with, like, if you're the Austrians and your military just gets wiped out by the French cavalry or whatever, however that worked. Never actually studied those battles in detail. You might have, the Austrian army might actually have some huge well-equipped division 50 miles away, but getting it anywhere where you need it to be because you're dealing with horses and foot soldiers, it's slow. So removing things and putting things back is really, really hard. Already by World War I, World War II, stuff is mechanized, which is sort of why if things are bad, you can bring on trains, you can bring people up, and you can kind of keep like, the La Voie Sacrée for the Verdun. You've got these long trains of trucks that are just keeping this, throwing things into this, to the mall of the battle. And nowadays, even more so. It's faster, particularly if there are good roads.
Yeah. And I think the road thing is actually particularly important here, because you do have, by World War One, you have the railroad and also trucks. Ludendorff calls 1918 the triumph of French and British trucks over German railroads. There's a lot of truth, and there's a lot of truth to that. The core of French operations in 1918 is their motorized heavy artillery power, which is really, it's not SPGs. It's just we're hooking up a bunch of 155 millimeter howitzers behind a truck, and we can now transport them at pretty fast rates. The real transformation, in a large part, one is the much wider spread of trucks, but also the much wider spread of paved roads. The major French disaster of 1940, where the Germans do achieve a significant tactical victory, a lot of the problem there is that there's just a delta, which is there was a small slice of each army which is mechanized in the sense of that they're moving at the speed of the combustion engine, and the vast bulk of the forces are footborne. Even the fully mechanized quote unquote British divisions and American divisions, that just means that their logistics are fully truck-borne. Their infantry still has to hoof it wherever they want to go. The army might be able to pool all their trucks together to maybe transport a division's worth of infantry by truck somewhere, but for the most part, there's still a significant speed differential. What's become particularly problematic for armies today in terms of frustrating attempts at decision is now, one, every infantry unit has its own vehicle. There's no longer the speed delta. And two, the proliferation of paved roads, which I think we take for granted now, but it has completely opened up the network of spaces which are viable to run forces in. I think a good example of this is before 2022, there was a lot of talk, even from fairly well-respected experts, about how the Russians, they're going to be rail-bound. Their logistics are going to be rail-bound. They can't move 150 kilometers away from their trailhead. And I was always very puzzled by this because if you run the numbers, a Russian motor rifle battalion has enough trucks to lift a very large amount of supplies. There's enough paved roads in Ukraine, and a paved road is so much more efficient at allowing truck throughput that as long as a truck can do one daily run there and back, that unit can sustain itself just from trucks. And when we're talking about a one round trip run, that's 250 kilometers from the railhead. That's 300 kilometers. 100 kilometers, if you look at how fast a truck moves on a highway, 100 kilometers is 1 hour of transit.
So simply the density of motorized transport. I mean, motorized transport's been around since World War One.
Mhm.
Now the density is at a radically higher level now, plus more paved roads. And then this has consequences for decision, for how long battles can last and how battles evolve and take shape and what results from battles.
Very much so, because, and also on top of this all, I think we also underrate electronic communications. The ability to say, not just the ability to transport things faster, but also the ability to tell the rear areas we need X amount of stuff. So when you look at, for example, like a good example here is 15th Motor Rifle Brigade. 15th Motor Rifle Brigade loses 1,000 killed in action in October of 2024. 15th Motor
Is this
Rifle
a
Brigade.
Russian unit?
Yes, the Russian 15th Motor Rifle Brigade. That brigade is not able to sustain those casualties if it is not able to be constantly telling back to its depots, send another 30 guys, send another 30 guys, send another 30 guys, just a much more efficient logistical throughput to where you're able to constantly replenish.
What about dispersion? Does that play a role in this?
Huge role. Trevor Dupuy, so I do some work with the Dupuy Institute and Chris Lawrence at TDI. And Trevor Dupuy, who's the founder of the Dupuy Institute, who, to me at least, is the father of modern operations analysis, at least in the United States. His biggest insight was armies have become substantially more lethal in terms of how much violence they can deploy. Casualties, in terms of casualties per men, are decreasing on a daily basis. Why? Dispersion. You're inflicting a lot more violence, but on a lot fewer men in that specific area. And that has a huge impact because it greatly reduces your ability to severely damage a unit in one go.
So this means also is adding to this phenomenon of battles no longer being decisive.
Exactly.
You just can't do that much damage.
Yeah, because even in World War I, so you look at, for example, the Somme, a great example on July 1st. So the French contribute a significant amount of divisions to the opening assault on the Somme. In south of the river, on day one, the Colonial Corps basically wipes out a German division. When I say wipe out, I mean that mostly for the infantry component, but they also overrun a lot of its artillery. That German division loses about 2/3 of its combat power in the space of 4 hours. It's done as a formation. You have to pull it out. it's no longer capable of meaningful resistance because of the way in which the fighting is occurring. That division has enough of its resources within about 1 to 3 miles of the front line. So when that initial advance and that initial onslaught, if it breaks through, it can really take with it a lot of a unit. The problem is now is that because of the way in which units are, as you say, so much more so much more dispersed, particularly in depth. Okay, you penetrate a unit by 3 to 4 kilometers, you've overrun a couple companies, maybe. There's still a lot more companies in the tank that brigade can then deploy either to halt you or to counterattack you.
Does that suggest that the rate of attrition in modern warfare is lower?
Complex question. Um, it's a complicated question because, in part as we've seen from the fighting in Ukraine, the rate of attrition is in large part defined by the tempo of operations. By the tempo of operations and by, simply put, how much men you're sending in. How much, basically, if you think of it almost like a coefficient of friction. How much of your surface are you applying to their surface, creating friction and creating, well, rubbings off, which are unfortunately casualties. So you can see, for example, in Ukraine, you've gone I don't have complete coverage, but I've got enough coverage of a specific group of forces that I can use that as a reliable base for projections by measuring what I have covered versus what other databases have covered. So I can basically establishing a multiplier. From what I can project, the killed in action in Ukraine for the Russians is about 40,000 in 2022. About 25,000 of which are Russian units, and about 15,000 of which are either from Wagner or the Donbass republics, Donetsk or Luhansk. By 2023, Donetsk and Luhansk are incorporated into Russia, so now it's just a matter of Russia versus Wagner. In 2023, killed in action, I project to be about 80,000. 80,000 with about 15,000 from Wagner. 2024, I have it between 140 and 175,000. So, and yes, the Russian force has been steadily increasing, but a lot of that increase occurs in 2023. The doubling in 2024 happens because the Russians decide to activate a constant grind of attacks along the entire front line. And so opposing forces still control the rate of attrition through the amount of the front line they want to activate and the intensity of the activation. Another complicating factor here when we look at the rate of attrition is also attrition as a percentage of the actual combat units, because the vast bulk of casualties have always been lost in the combat formations, what people would call the maneuver units. And this is something that many nations have had to consider. The Finns, for example, when they're deciding as to who qualifies for their medal for being in a frontline unit at the end of the war in World War II, they're having to consider, okay, do anti-tank gunners get a count? Yes, they're at the front line, but their casualty rates are nothing like the infantry. One of the big issues is it's still true today. And it increases over time as casualties increased and as Russia ran out of vehicles. So by, for example, 2024, 95% of the killed in action in the 2nd Combined Arms Army by the middle of 2024 are infantry. But infantry are a smaller portion of any one force than they've ever been. And so when we're talking about the rate of attrition, even though the total numbers are down, the total number of casualty exposed persons, for lack of a better word, is also down. So that has to be taken into account. As a question of pure attrition, if you're in a maneuver unit, Ukraine, at least for the Russians, I would say that Ukraine is probably as lethal in terms of chances to die if you're an infantryman in a year as World War I.
It's pretty high. But then, okay, so then what's the difference in terms of, let's think this through. It's as dangerous to be an infantryman in Ukraine as it was in World War One, right? You just said that? Okay. What percentage of the force of the Ukrainian military is that at-risk infantryman versus a comparably total size British unit in World War One? I'm under the impression that it's just very fewer. The number of people who are combat exposed really at risk is actually much, much, much smaller.
Yes. So if you look at, this is where it gets really weird. I can't really say anything about Ukraine because I just don't have good rosters or good figures. For Russia, I would estimate that, let's do like a battalion census. On average, so a modern Russian model motor rifle company, if fully staffed up, contains about 440 men in its infantry companies. So at the battalion level, about 3/4 of its men are infantry and has got about 150 enablers. Or at least are in the infantry companies, has got about 150 enablers. A British infantry battalion in World War I is pretty much 100% infantry as we would define it. Once we get up to the brigade level, the complicating factor here is that a lot of Russian brigades are carrying with them extra infantry battalions. It's very common to attach territorial leg infantry regiments to brigades. Some brigades in the former Donbass army, the 51st, like Ninth Motor Rifle Brigade, which is an ex-Donetsk brigade, I think is carrying 3 extra rifle regiments on its roster. So it's difficult, but let's call it that infantry is, let's call it at 35%. Let's say that the infantry company, let's be generous here, that the men of the infantry companies are about 35 to 40% of your median Russian brigade. If you compare it to a British brigade in World War I, a British brigade is basically 85% infantry and 15% enablers. Once you get to force wide, oh, sorry.
So what does this mean for when we look at European militaries, modern British, French, German,
Okay.
etc., where they have lots of capabilities, but I believe in all of them, the percentage of those, the proportion of those forces that we could describe in terms of kind of at-risk maneuver, the grunts who are actually shooting and getting shot at, is really pretty small. So I'm trying to I just want to think through what are the implications for them. Does this make them more or less vulnerable in modern warfare, or more or less capable of absorbing attrition than they might have been in the past, or certainly than they should be? Is there a warning that Western military should be taking heeding?
Very much so. It means that those units are very fragile. Now, the killed in action rate at the start of a conflict is going to be lower for them. Vehicles, you can either shoot at metal or you can shoot at men. As long as you have metal, you're going to be incurring lower losses among your men. And that's a very noticeable trend. To go back to the Russian Second Combined Arms Army, Second Combined Arms Army starts the big Avdiivka Pokrovsk offensive, having been pulled off the line, completely refreshed its vehicle park. Everyone has all the tanks they're supposed to. Everyone has all the IFVs they're supposed to. They're fully kitted out with metal. At the start of the offensive, they're heavily engaged, they're taking heavy losses, but they're more balanced and they're lower. You can see it over time as they burn through their vehicle parks, casualty rates start skyrocketing. The lesson for the European militaries is that, yes, in the opening weeks of a conflict, they're going to be taking significant losses, but at least it'll be somewhat more controlled. As they lose their vehicle parks, they're going to become extremely fragile. And there's not a lot you can do about that except for having a lot of spare infantry. Right now, every Russian brigade, every Russian regiment, and additionally at the divisional level, every Russian division has what's called a reserve rifle battalion, which is a force of it's a battalion that it counts about 550 men, of which 450 of those are trigger pullers. It is a completely non-viable unit in every other sense of the word. It can feed itself and it can maybe transport itself. That's it. What it does, it solely exists to be a container for extra infantrymen that you can pull out and refill your battalions with as you go. And when you're looking at European force structure, that's basically what you need, because those infantry dismounts are gonna drain fast, and you're gonna lose your combat power as they get drained.
That's interesting. Okay, so one lesson is, hey, European militaries, you need more infantry units so that you've got more of a reserve, even if your force structure doesn't necessarily call for it, but attrition is going to make this a necessity. What about also this issue where, like with all the European militaries, they might have really awesome kit. They're going to roll into battle with their fancy CV90s and their Leopards and whatnot, but they don't have many of them. And it's not like World War II where you can just crank them out by the thousands. Does that change? Are they, one thought is that very quickly they will end up not having their CV90s and the Leopard 2s, meaning now they're on foot, or now they're sort of digging out of their mothballs, their patents that are somewhere in some storage locker somewhere. What happens in the second week of the war when there's small numbers of CV90s and Leopard 2s are gone.
It becomes a choice. Because as I've said, once you lose those vehicles, once your force is mostly dismounted, your casualty rates are gonna skyrocket.
Okay.
And it becomes very much a political choice because, as I said before, if you don't have those infantry reserves, you're also gonna burn through your infantry very quickly. So it's not just a matter of digging the Pattons or the M113s, though I would note here the M113s have proven to be perfectly useful in Ukraine. It's a good vehicle. And even the Pattons, one of the reasons why T-62 has been taken out of swords by the Russians is that having a tank is better than not having a tank.
Yeah.
You know, a Patton
Better patent than no
a
patent.
Exactly. So that in and of itself is not gonna be a crisis level. What's gonna be the real political crisis is that since you don't have the manpower reserves, you're gonna have to be calling up people to chuck them to base if you wanna continue fighting, you're gonna be calling up people to chuck a rifle in their hands and putting them in a trench. If you don't have I mean, you might have I mean, at first it's gonna be reservists, and then it's gonna be if you wanna continue fighting, it's gonna be conscripts. But you have to accept that you're gonna be burning through those maneuver companies fast, and that's gonna cause a lot of very awkward politically awkward situations. It's what you saw in Ukraine. With the Ukrainian forces who come in with an extremely large active duty vehicle fleet. Ukraine enters the war with more active duty tanks than France, Germany, and Italy combined, especially if you go by readiness rates. But by April or May of 2022, these very feel-good TDF units who were fairly capable when fighting, defending their village, they're being dragged off to the Donbass to be shelled in a trench with only a rifle. And that was a very politically awkward and very politically tense moment. But if you want to keep fighting, it's what you're going to have to do.
Is this an argument for conscription? Or like, going back to early 20th century force models where you've got these large, because of conscription, you have these large reserve forces that you can draw on. Everybody goes for like 9 months and then they disappear, but then that creates this cadre of reservists that large cadre, millions of people that you can call upon who've all had a modicum of military training.
Very much so. I think that conscription for a lot of forces for most European forces, is going to be necessary. You can see conscription was extremely beneficial to Ukraine. One of the advantages of the TDF, one of the reasons why the TDF is so successful is that because of the initial crisis of the war, Ukrainian Central Command says, don't try to get on a train to reach your unit's garrison in Zhytomyr Oblast. You're on the front lines, stay in place, grab a rifle from the armory, defend your village. So you created a very effective networked defense of fairly trained light infantry who had experience in static warfare. On the Russian side, the Russians, not so much an issue of conscription, but kind of the conscription related element was they had a large pool of former contract soldiers. And so they were able to, and when force manning got to a crisis point that was revealed in the September 2022 offensives, especially at the Kharkiv, what the Russians do in the mobilization orders, they just take everybody who had signed a contract, who had agreed to a period of being a professional soldier in the past, and they all mobilize them. So you suddenly had an infusion of about 300,000 men with prior military experience that you could surge into your forces. And if you want to be viable on a modern battlefield, you need that kind of reserve. Or even you need that when we're talking about available manpower. What conscription does, it's not just a matter of having the reserves to mobilize, it's also a matter of having the active duty personnel. I think one of the biggest limitations for European forces and also American forces is extreme personnel constraints. Professional personnel are very expensive. They're very expensive to maintain, and there's not a lot of them. The U.S. Army, for example, is consistently about 40,000 to 50,000 people short in terms of recruiting targets. And when you look at what you need to be viable in a modern conflict, which is having those reserve rifle battalions, which Russia didn't have at the start, quickly generated, particularly for the mobilization, what European army is capable of setting aside 400 men or 500 men per brigade just to be spare infantrymen. I mean, even the large armies, even France or Germany would struggle very much to even be able to rationally have a rational argument to set aside 3,000 or 4,000 men. And so if you want to be viable, you need the bodies, and European armies don't have the bodies. They try to compensate for not having the bodies with some very expensive kit, but sustainability in conflict isn't about what your best thing can do, it's about whether you can man a village with a platoon.
That's very interesting. I mean, what about I think the fantasy is to be able to replace bodies with robots, right? And the idea is like you have the robots fight it out, and then only afterwards do you send the people in. And to show this works or ever will work, maybe we've been watching too many Star Wars drones,
Yeah.
right? Those cartoons, the drone wars.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, even with the drone wall, the primary maintenance of the forward zone, the FPV drones, I mean, even there's some very major risks. One, it's still very vulnerable to climate. If you have a constant problem has been Russian advances on very foggy days. Because if you can't get the FPV drones in, your drone wall is done. And I mean, two, yes, it has at times produced very disproportionate losses. The Ukrainians will talk about, 25 to 1 killed in action ratio, which actually may be the case for certain sectors for certain periods of time. I have no doubt that there's even particularly large sectors of the front where there's blocks of time where all the Russians are doing is stacking up corpses trying to cross a field. But what's also been true is that once the Russians have a foothold in a village or once they have a foothold in a city, that city is gone because to be able to eject them, you need to have the boots on the ground. There was a lot of hope that unmanned ground vehicles could do that, but even there, the human body is just a much more effective tool for moving around than a UGV. A UGV is very limited.
Can a case be made that the Ukraine war is this sort of this exceptional thing, and thus none of these lessons are applicable for anything else? I mean, there's something
There's a
about the
lot.
Ukraine war that might make us say, we
Mhm.
don't.
There's a lot of people who want to believe that,
Okay.
and I think particularly you can particularly see within a lot of American military writing. I think there's a lot of cargo cultism because for the most part, I mean, the modern American military is staffed with officers who have not faced a credible threat to a US battalion in 60 years, 65 years. The one of the biggest advantages we had going actually into the Desert Storm was that we were still led by the Vietnam War generation. We were led by officers who had faced an enemy who was capable. Classic example, Nha Trang. Nha Trang in 1965, the North Vietnamese nearly destroyed an entire American division. So we were led in 1991 by officers who had known true fear at a large unit level. And so, for example, best anecdote, the head logistical officer for the fighting, he saw the initial ammunition projections for what they were going to ship in theater and say, no, triple that. Because even though it ended up being overkill, he wasn't leaving anything to chance. The problem now is because you have this generation of officers who have basically, there's the, curb stomping in 1991. There's this curb stomping of an even weaker force in 2003. They have a lot of ideas of what maneuver is that aren't really tied to reality. So they'll just say, oh, we'll just use maneuver. Ukraine and Russia entered in this war with large mechanized armies built to fight large mechanized mobile warfare. These aren't stupid people. These are people who have significantly more combat experience than any American officer. If they're not moving, there's a reason for it. And it's not because they're uniquely incapable. It's not because it's not because this is an Eritrea, Ethiopia situation where it's just divisions of infantrymen led by fairly poorly educated officers. I think to me the real kind of red flag moment for anybody who thinks that we're going to be able to avoid fighting in that kind of manner was October 10th, 2023, even before the FPV drone revolution. It's the opening day of the Battle of Avdiivka. The Russians concentrated an entire combined arms army on a about 5 kilometer front. They do everything quote unquote right by the standards of maneuver warfare. They have tactical surprise. They have strategic surprise. They have a large mass of aerial delivered fires. They have artillery superiority. And nothing mattered. They made 500 meters of progress because a single Ukrainian artillery battery was unsuppressed, and that battery happened to have a couple drones overflying the region, which meant that it spotted the attack columns from those brigades 7 kilometers behind their forward line of troops, and they already had artillery shells falling on those columns before 15-30 minutes before they even crossed their FLOT.
Wow. Can you say something very quickly about the FPV drone revolution? I keep hearing this. I think I know
Mhm.
what it is, but could you spell that out for us?
Yeah. So what I think a lot of people, this is before, there's a lot of cargo cultism. A
All right.
lot of
What do you mean by
American
the cargo
officers,
cultism?
Well, so so the cargo cult itself, it's a phenomenon that emerged in Southeast Asia, like for example, Papua New Guinea after 1945, because, the New Guinea campaign, you have basically uncontacted tribes who suddenly have modern warfare occurring in where they're living. And so the cargo cult so they saw, for example, planes delivering all sorts of things to these airstrips. And so the cargo cult is okay, if we wave this sign in the air, magically a plane, like magically stuff's going to come out of the sky, because they don't have any real connection, because they don't want to have any real understanding of what's happening. They don't have any connection to what are the physical processes that are occurring. So instead they turn to kind of magical thinking, that all you need to do is you wave the thing in the air and stuff falls out of the sky. And why I use it in a military context is that a lot of American officers, they say, oh, we'll have air power. What does air power mean? A bomb doesn't magically become more effective just because it's dropped from a plane. What air power means is that you're delivering explosives by air to a deeper area of the enemy than what you might be able to deliver by artillery. It has a very physical reality. Same thing for the cargo cultism of maneuver. People think, oh, you just go fast. Well, why are they going fast? They're going fast because they have defeated any enemy unit capable of slowing them down.
So it's
You
the
don't,
making of assumptions that certain capabilities are going to exist when we really
yes,
have no reason to assume that that's going to be true.
exactly. Because they're not approaching these capabilities as if they have a tangible connection with the physical reality. They're approaching these capabilities like a card in a card game. Oh, I play air power, therefore I win. Oh, I play maneuver, therefore I gain an advantage. Because they've never had to fight an enemy, or even really trained to fight an enemy who is credibly capable of slowing or stopping them. So to kind of pull back to the FPV drone revolution, a lot of American officers and a lot of officers think that FPV drones are there as a replacement for air power. But that's not the case. What the FPV drone does and why it's so revolutionary is that it's basically a way to, especially now with the rise of the fiber optic drone, it's a way to basically take an RPG round, to park it 20 kilometers behind the lines along a road, to watch the road, and then to at will pop it up and ambush a truck. It is, and same thing for at the front. It's a way to basically pinpoint and fly an anti-tank round into whatever you want to. And so when I talk about the FPV drone revolution, it's that. It's the massive expansion. It basically, it's a complete cutting of any delay and the ability to get a weapon on target. And even the cutting of a lot of the inaccuracies in ranging in a weapon. To look at what that means in practice, let's say you want to stop a combined arms breach. Because minefields, one of the biggest realities of this war is anti-tank mines. Anti-tank mines are the mass proliferation of anti-tank mines is the foundation for what the war has become. So let's say we're talking about a combined arms breach. The normal, what the Americans would say is, of course, we could break through in Zaporizhia in 2023. What we would do is we would use artillery to suppress enemy fires. We'd create an opening. We would create an opening to where we can insert what starts off with really a reinforced company. They put in the M-click. The M-click detonates the mines, open up the path. The bulldozers go through. They widen it. The tanks go through. Widen the breach. Widen the breach. Widen the breach. Now you've got a brigade moving through. Okay. All right. You can see how that works in a mechanized fight. Now we add FPV drones. With FPV drones, all you need is one FPV team within 15 kilometers of that site who is unsuppressed, who can get a single drone up in the air, and if they take out your M-click with that drone, which is, given that you're basically delivering an RPG round onto a vehicle whose whole job is to hold thousands of pounds of explosives, it's going to go boom, your entire breach is screwed. Not only has your breach been spotted, it's been stopped in a way that artillery couldn't really. And now that it's been stopped up, now artillery can start working on all the vehicles that have been piled up behind, which is what
So
happened in Zaporizhzhia.
it's almost like a sniper in
Mhm.
that you can do something very targeted and very clever. It's not just like chucking a mortar bomb. It's very precisely, oh, look at that. That's an M-click truck. That's a whatever. And then you
Mhm.
just take it out
Yeah.
at will and accurately.
And not just that, it's almost like being able to deploy a sniper at will 30 kilometers behind, or even it's like, kind of for the ability to deploy an ATGM team 30 kilometers behind the enemy lines. and just park them there. I think one of the latest really changes you've seen, is what the Russians have really specialized in, is just shutting down all movement to the front in a 20-kilometer region by just saturating the area with drone teams, using fiber optic drones to just park their drones on the road, wait for a truck, hit the truck. In the past, if you
How
wanted
do
to
they
shut
get
down a
them to
road.
how do they park them on the road? Do they fly them there and just settle them?
Yeah, they fly them there. With a fiber optic drone can go far fur can go they're more expensive, but not necessarily that much, and they
Uh-huh.
can go far further than a normal drone because they've got fiber, because they're everything's being relayed through the fiber optic cable, so you don't have to worry about radio signals. So a lot of what, for example, Rubicon is doing is just flying a drone out to a known logistical road, having the FPV drone set itself down and go into kind of a quiet mode on the road, and just using the camera feed to observe the road and wait for a target. And that is just, in terms of interdiction, even the American Air Force on its best day could not do that against a peer force. And if you wanted to do that with artillery, shutting down a road with artillery means having a 155 millimeter shell falling on that road every minute. That's a much, much bigger lift than just parking some drones.
So, I mean, I get from this idea of the battle these days, if you can even call it that, is it's dispersed, it's slow, it's kind of inching around because every move you make is ultimately observable, and uh and that's often interrupted by unpleasant things. And it's like this very slow grappling, and it's hard to even understand what maneuver means in this kind of context. What even is maneuver?
I mean, I don't think that what is maneuver in this context
Hmm.
is the question that very intelligent men who have an immense amount of combat experience on both sides of this war have been trying to find an answer to now for really 4 years.
Interesting. Very interesting.
And the best answer so far the Russians have created is, well, we can't engage in the fast, long running breakthroughs we want to. So we're going to build units from the ground up to be really designed to sustain just a nonstop grind of attacks. One thing I was looking at when I was looking at Second Combined Arms Army's casualties, because I now have all of that army's brigades down to the daily level. I was thinking, okay, maybe is there any pattern? Because there are breakthroughs that occur. There are breakthroughs that occur that open up a defensive line and cause a period of faster movement. So I looked at, for example, Attrition, which is a breakthrough that happens in about May of 2024. And I was looking at, okay, is this a planned breakthrough? Do you see a pattern of quieter days leading up to it, then a clear day showing clear signs of heightened activity? And the answer is no. Rather, what you're seeing is brigades constantly generating these platoon to company sized assaults nonstop, and eventually one of them catches a sector which wasn't as covered as it should be, catches a unit when it's rotating, a breakthrough occurs where it kind of gets itself a hook in the enemy lines, and then more attacks kind of just grind on forward, create a crumbling of the defensive line. But it's not a planned breakthrough, if you will.
Okay. So there's no more Kesselschlacht. That's all gone. There's no more Blitzkrieg, right? It's
Mhm,
grappling, trying to find these little openings, maneuvers. And then I guess ultimately now maybe we're left with indirect strategies, right? So
mhm.
we're back to Basil Hayden, right? No, Basil Hayden. Isn't that a bourbon? Um
Basil
Hart
Hart?
Basil Hart. This shows you where my mind is. Uh that's funny. It's like an interesting Freudian slip. Yeah, I wish this were Basil Hayden. That would be great. Yeah, like basically, like his whole beef was like he thought that everybody was mad to kind of keep trying to get a breakthrough in the Western Front. You really, really just need to do some sort of indirect strategy, either a different front, another front, or just some other way of getting at the enemy than throwing troops into the meat grinder. I guess.
Well, I mean, when you look at, Basil Hart was kind of crazy. Um, Also very fascist. If you
Hmm.
look at where he went in the interwar period, he was like I think he's like a Basil Hart and sorry, Little Hart. Yeah, it's
Little Hart.
Little Hart and then Basil, the journalist, who are kind of the two alongside Churchill. Those are the three kind of core architects of this view of World War One as just chewing barbed wire. that there was this secret other method which could have totally worked out. The basic reality, actually, I think the biggest lesson you can take from World War I is that it's possible to do everything right and it still not produce the desired outcome. Which is why I turn back to October 10th. October 10th, 2023 is a textbook armored breakthrough operation. Could not have planned it better if you were the Russians. Did everything right? Still failed because at that time the conditions were that the conditions allowed the Ukrainians to just stop it.
Fascinating.
And there's no magic button you can press to avoid all of this. When you're looking at indirect effects. Pre-war, a lot of people thought, oh, warfare is cyber war now. It's going to be cyber war, cyber war, cyber war. I remember getting piled onto by futurists every time I pointed out, actually, no, warfare is still managed by the artillery tube. And lo and behold, what did we see in 2022? Cyber war gives you a day's worth of openings where you burn every single security breach you've built up over the course of years. It gives you some leverage that you can amplify other operations, but by day 2 or 3, it all got shot down. There's no other real option other than what one of my friends jokingly calls the Sasho theory, the Sasho Todorov theory of warfare, which is you take money, you convert money into explosives, you dump the explosives on the enemy, and eventually the enemy quits. But then again, this isn't that different from even the great maneuver wars that we've talked about. You look at World War II, people constantly talk about World War II, the great campaigns of maneuver in the East. I think the classic example here is 1942-1943. From 1942 to 1943, the front line in the South moves thousands of kilometers back and forth, and it starts in 1942 in Kharkiv, and it finishes in 1943 in Kharkiv. None of these great maneuver battles produced this decisive victory. What it did produce was moments of severe damage, which built up over time and over time and over time to the point that eventually Germany was drained of its ability to resist.
So ultimately, it's always just about attrition.
Pretty much. But none of this is even that new. Classic example, go back to Clausewitz. Clausewitz is inspired by the Napoleonic Wars. But what's important to consider with the Napoleonic Wars is that while individual campaigns, or you could call them individual wars, within the Napoleonic Wars might end with a decisive battle with an Austerlitz or a Wagram, in reality, the real end of the Napoleonic Wars was when in 1814, Napoleon is marching 15-year-old boys and mules up the Chemin des Dames. That's the end of the Napoleonic Wars. When France has no manpower left and its horse herds are completely exhausted. Same thing before. People like the Kesselschlacht, the battle of all battles, Cannae. Cannae didn't end the war. Even some of the great Roman victories didn't end the war. The Second Punic War ends with Rome having bled Carthage to such a catastrophic level that it finally loses a battle it can't recover from.
So this is your book. This is going to be your book, The Myth of Battle.
Yeah, I guess.
No, that's really, really, really interesting. Sasha, thank you so much for coming on. This has been absolutely fascinating. I hope actually this won't be the last time we have you on. And this is great. Carry on. This has been very useful. Any final thoughts, final comments, last bombs you want to drop on us?
Fiat currency has always existed. Gold is a myth. Don't believe in it. Fiat has always defined the currencies around us. It's been a pleasure to be with you.
Okay.